Hello, welcome to On the Record. My name is Adam Jasa. Is Donald Trump's America bent on undermining the United Nations language on Russia's illegal and brutal occupation of Ukrainian land? Tonight I'm going on the record with Annalena Baerbock, the current president of the UN General Assembly, to clarify if the UN is moving closer to an official recognition of Russia's conquests, and whether that would ring a death knell for the organization set up 80 years ago to uphold international law and protect peace. President Baerbock, thank you very much for joining us on TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
Madam President, is it true that the United States is pushing to remove language on territorial integrity of Ukraine and Russia's aggression from the latest UN resolution on human rights abuses in Ukrainian occupied territories?
The General Assembly, so the vast majority of member states of the United Nations, has been crystal clear since the Russian invasion that the right of your own sovereignty, territorial integrity, is a right to every country, to every member of the United Nations, and therefore the breach of it is a violation of the Charter, and it has been reflected in many, many resolutions of the General Assembly, and it's also being reflected in upcoming resolutions. So I don't have any hint or discussions what you mentioned right now currently.
So you provided me with a diplomatic answer, but if I read you correctly, you're saying that even if there were such a push, the majority of UN members will not agree to that, in your opinion?
Well, in the latest resolutions, they have been repeating what they said from the beginning of this war, that Ukraine, like any other country in the world, has the right to its full territory. We had also had a debate yesterday with the International Criminal Court. They presented their yearly report, also reporting on the violation of international law with regard to the deporting of children from Ukraine territory, with regard to arrest warrants. So the General Assembly has been clear on all these cases, but as you know, the world is turning over and over again, and resolutions are being rediscussed over and over again. So it's always up to every member state to recommit to the foundations of our charter, to recommit that the war of aggression, that war crimes, that crimes against humanity, that genocide are a deep violation of international law, and that the Charter is crystal clear that the UN has to stand up for peace and security, development and human rights.
So the evidence that you just mentioned from the reports, UN reports, but also the International Court of Human Rights and other courts, this evidence is so convincing that you believe such a resolution will come to pass in the Assembly when time comes?
The role of the President of the General Assembly is not what the President believes herself, but I'm representing the General Assembly, 193 member states, as diverse as they are, and if they do not agree on a topic, then it's the majority of member states underlining what the wish of the General Assembly and therefore the United Nations majority is. We have seen that, for example, also in the case of Gaza, with resolution being adopted with similar votes. The last time, the two-states solution resolution, the New York Declaration, with 142 member states. We've seen that in similar cases also with resolution on the Russian invasion in Ukraine with similar numbers, and the President of the General Assembly represents the will of the General Assembly, and sometimes it's the majority. And this is why in these times it's so important that member states ask themselves, what are we standing for? What are our own values and interests? interest, how to defend the international system. And when we had here all heads of state, beginning of this session, the 80th session, the high-level week, the vast majority of heads of states underline that the United Nations, that the Charter is their life insurance, because most of the countries do have a bigger neighbor, and they know if they would accept the violation of international law, if they would tolerate a war of aggression, then no country could sleep in future in silence.
Right, but if I remember correctly, the original resolution from 2022 in October, and there was overwhelming support among UN member countries. In some later resolutions, these majorities oscillated, and sometimes they were smaller than before. Do you have a feeling, watching at what's going on and meeting all the officials, heads of state and diplomats accredited with the UN, do you get the impression that support for Ukraine is eroding?
We see in these times, in a very shaky and fragmented geopolitical world, that nothing is written in stone. And therefore, it's very important that member states always argue again and again what they are standing for, what the values of the United Nations are, how to keep up the principles of international law. And this regards Ukraine, also having in mind that for countries in the Pacific Ocean, for example, Ukraine is very far away. They have their own challenges in their area, looking at climate crisis. We just had this horrible hurricane here in the Caribbean, destroying whole infrastructure of countries. We have wars going on in Sudan with horrible violations of international law, with suffering of children, with rape going on, with hunger going on. So obviously there are many different crises around the world, and therefore for every crisis it is very important that the attention is being raised again, that it's made crystal clear where do we have an violation of international law, and to stand up for the rights of the people and the rights of the Charter of the United Nations.
Do you see a group of countries within the UN framework that are sort of leading this effort to continue making the UN relevant for the types of crisis you just mentioned? Or is this getting sort of sidelined by other issues?
In every crisis is a chance, and one should not be in international diplomacy and international politics if you cannot stand headwinds and if you're giving up very easily, because diplomacy is all about standing up even in the darkest hours, to resume when it's really hard. We have seen that for many peace treaties and peace negotiations in the past. It took sometimes a year to succeed a ceasefire, and therefore joining forces over and over again for peace and security is especially crucial in these times. And as I said, in every crisis is also a chance. Lately, there has been a stronger push for cross-regional cooperations, that members from all around the world joined whenever international law was under pressure. This was the example with Ukraine, when countries from all around the world, even though if they were on the total other side of the world, said, but this is not only about Ukraine, this is about defending international law and not accepting a breach of the Charter. And then the opposite is also true. If small island states, for example, are underlining that if one would ignore the climate crisis and would not fight the climate crisis, this would be the end of their country, because they would literally vanish in the ocean with sea level rise, then it has to be up to all the member states standing up for the rights of these people living in these countries and joining forces. And we have seen that also lately on climate conferences, not only now in Belém, but also in the conferences before. For example, 2 years ago, when we had the climate conference in Dubai, in UAE, where member states from all around the world, Latin America, Africa, also strong push from Europe, stood up and said fighting the climate crisis is the biggest security delivery we can do, because the climate crisis is the biggest security threat for the whole population around the world, and this is why we have to phase out of fossil fuels and invest in renewable. And this cross-regional cooperation we can see in different fields, and I think this is actually a new strength of international cooperation and therefore also a new strength of the United Nations. However, it's not easy because the headwinds are also quite strong.
You're very diplomatic in your answers, and I hate to push you a little bit on this.
That's my job.
But, you know, in management at least, you know, any project, any initiative, any organization, particularly an international one, needs leadership, needs countries or people who will become the cheerleaders and leading by example. And you know, I'm trying to figure out who these days performs this role. You have, on the Security Council, you have the United States, you have some European powers, you have China and Russia. And some of these actors seem not too much interested in making the UN successful in the endeavors you mentioned. So I'm asking you again, who do you see as the leaders, as the nations that really care about this?
Those who believe in international law. It's up to them now. And they would have a big power if they join forces. And it's not only one big country which has to stand up for international law, but it's a majority. And if the majority is loud and clear and is especially united, it's small island states joining forces with middle-income countries and then strong economic powers. And you mentioned the European Union. The European Union is the biggest internal market. It has some power. If the European Union joins forces with Latin American countries, with African countries, be it on climate change, be it on peace and security, be it on the reform of the United Nations, it's a big, big majority. We have the African Union, where we have on the African continent the biggest population. If they join forces together with other regional groups, then they will have a big majority. And yes, we need this leadership by cross-regional cooperation to secure our international order and also to enable that the United Nations will reform. Because the United Nations is a life insurance of the people around the world and of the states around the world. But it's also under heavy pressure politically and financially. So if it's not reforming, then those forces which you were mentioning, which have the intention of set up a new international structure where might is right and it's not the law which defines the rights of all the people, might succeed. And therefore, those who believe in international law, in freedom and justice, in their own interest, have to join forces now on all the different aspects.
What I find fascinating is that, you know, during the Cold War, the UN system in the end worked. It wasn't always ideal, but it worked. Some of the voting on the Security Council was predictable, but there was some balancing act that in the end worked and delivered. And these days, it seems to me that there are too many actors on the UN Security Council that actually are not interested in what you're talking about, that they are actually pursuing an agenda where might is right. And unfortunately, it seems that the United States has joined those ranks. So that must make your work really difficult.
As I said, international politics and international diplomacy, it's nothing if you want to have an easy life. But you have to work with the world as it is. We cannot wish for a world like it should be, but we have to deal with the world as it is. And we have seen also latest, and I'm staying an optimist, because if you're not believing that you can change the course for the better, then you should just resign. We have seen these successes. For example, there was this leadership by Saudi Arabia and France with regard to the two-state solution conference I mentioned, but also with the resolution beforehand. It was not unanimity, all member states, but they pushed it forward, and afterwards followed also the peace summit and the peace agreement. And therefore it is very, very important that countries stand up and take the chances of joining forces. And again, we cannot wish back the times from before. We're living in this world, and we should also use the tools and technology we are having. In an interconnected world right now, with social media, with digitalization, there's also power by society, by the people. And we have seen that also with regard to the war in Ukraine. The big outreach of what's going on, the atrocities which are happening, it raises attention in many, many countries around the world, and then people will engage. We have seen that also with the war in Gaza. There was also especially public debates pushing forward to a solution to come to a ceasefire. And therefore, in these times, having an active political, international diplomacy where you explain what's going on, where you explain what the answers could be if everybody would join forces, I think is crucially important.
So in your negotiations with, or discussions with different countries and representatives, heads of state and diplomats, concerning the UN reform and how to make it more adaptable to the challenges of this new period in human history, what seems to be the consensus? Where do you think there is the biggest space to actually change something substantial?
Change is going on the whole time. And again, it's up to every country, every region, how to engage. For example, we just had the second World Social Summit. After 30 years, the world met again for social development. It's the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, a commitment by the international community to fight hunger, to fight poverty, but also to ensure that every child can go to school. Unfortunately, not all heads of states from all regions were there. There was a very active engagement from African countries, from Gulf countries. There were fewer from Europe, for example, heads of states. So there was a declaration being passed, a commitment to deliver on sustainable development, because we know if poverty and hunger is growing, people will move, will migrate to other regions. It will bring a pressure on other member countries, and therefore might also enhance other crises. So sustainable development is heavily connected to peace and security.
Right.
Should be also in the self-interest of European countries, and therefore in these kind of areas everybody should engage. And we adopted this Doha Declaration on Sustainable Development by consensus. So it's a success in these times where consensus is harder than ever before.
Consensus is harder than ever before, but is there a consensus about, in practical terms, expanding the UN Security Council? Several countries want to be on it, and there is sort of broad consensus that some areas of the world are not adequately represented. Do you see, for example, India joining, or maybe some other country?
Clearly, the United Nations, and especially the Security Council, is not representing the world as it is today. It was built 80 years ago when the world had a total different phase. As you mentioned, Africa, for example, is not represented on the Security Council as a permanent member at all. But it will be the continent with most of the population. So this is totally unjust. Also, Latin America is not represented. So therefore, yes, we need a reform. We have this big reform process. It's called UN80. And obviously, the reform of the Security Council should be part of it. We are working on it since years. And here the reform, it comes in tiny, tiny steps. One big step was the veto initiative that permanent members have to explain, for example, if there's a veto against a resolution regarding Ukraine and Russia has a veto, they have to explain themselves in the General Assembly. Same was just a couple of weeks ago. The US has to explain their veto with regard to humanitarian delivery to Gaza and other parts of the war in Gaza. This is only tiny reform steps, but on that one there's a big debate going on right now. Next week we will have the discussion again that many member states call for a text to be negotiated on the reform of the Security Council. But as you described it, and this is just the reality we're living in, the permanent members of the Security Council would have to agree as well. And therefore, this is not an easy task, but it's obviously overdue because many member states feel it as totally not only unjust, but not representing the world in the 21st century anymore.
You're a former German foreign minister, and as far as I understand, Germany is also interested in potentially being on the UN Security Council. What's the point of having another European country there rather than, for example, a seat for the European Union as an organization? What's your take on this?
The discussions are going on with different proposals. There's a group of 4 where also, you mentioned Germany belongs to, India, Brazil, Japan and Germany. There's another group called a group of 69, L69. They're especially calling for the representation of Africa, but also an overall reform. It's not only about the members who would join the permanent security members, but also about the veto, because obviously many people feel as well that the veto by one country, especially if it's affected by a war going on, is something which has to be reformed. So it's a bigger discussion about the whole reform process, and there are different proposals on the table. And we will have 2 co-chairs who are organizing this debate from the Netherlands and also Kuwait to bring together all these different proposals. And then member states have to say if they really want to start discussing.
How do you see China's role in trying to reform the UN? When you were foreign minister in Germany, you were sometimes critical of China's involvement with Russia and supporting Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but at the same time you also argued for China as a good partner for Europe. So how are they acting when you meet them?
Again, in my current position, I'm the president of all 193, and especially also with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council with their big role. I'm interacting, obviously, with all of them because we have to find solution for the reform process, for peace in the world altogether. And China has, in this regard, especially lately, being very active in saying we need a reform. We need also with regard to the financing. They had also some financing outstanding. Now they are paying for it. So there are totally new dynamics also going on in this situation. And again, every country has to ask themselves, what is the United Nations worth for my own country? And this is why I asked also every head of state when they had that big debate here in September to give example what the United Nations has done for every country, because every country around the world benefited from the United Nations, but also what every country is ready to commit, because if some are withdrawing, we obviously need then even bigger support from other countries around the world. And China in this case has been coming up with saying we would like to engage more, and every other country has to ask themselves if they are also coming up with more engagement in these challenging times for the United Nations.
What can the UN do to help Ukraine protect its sovereignty and end this war?
The UN is a guarantor for peace and security, and especially the Security Council, which has a responsibility to ensure peace and security around the world. And if the Security Council is not capable, for example, in this case, because of the veto, then it's the General Assembly which has to stand up, and the General Assembly has stood up by majority in the last years, and I'm expecting that the General Assembly is again making very clear that every country in the world, including Ukraine, has a right to its own territory, and nobody is allowed to invade, so the war has to end.
Madam President, thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well.
Thank you very much for watching. This was On the Record. See you next week.